In the summer of 1924, a group of miners working near Mount St. Helens claimed they were attacked in the night by a group of violent, ape-like creatures. The story became so famous that the area itself eventually became known as Ape Canyon. But from the very beginning, there was a problem. The miners insisted something terrifying happened out there. Investigators were not convinced. And that is what makes this case so compelling even now. Because Ape Canyon is not just a monster story. It is one of those old wilderness cases that sits in the worst possible place for easy answers. Too strange to dismiss cleanly. Too shaky to prove. And old enough that most of what remains is fear, rumor, conflicting reports, and one question that never really went away. What actually happened to those men on that mountain? The case began in July 1924, when a small group of prospectors working near the southeast side of Mount St. Helens reported a violent encounter with what newspapers described as ape men or mountain devils. Later retellings most often center on Fred Beck, whose version of events became the best known. According to the miners, the trouble began before the attack itself, when they noticed large tracks in the area and claimed to have seen strange human-like figures moving through the wilderness. Then came the incident that pushed the story into legend. One of the miners reportedly saw one of the creatures at close range during daylight and fired at it. In some versions, the creature was said to have fallen into a canyon. Whether that actually happened is impossible to confirm now. But according to the miners, that was the moment everything changed. They believed the creatures came back that night, not to watch, not to hide, to attack. The men said they had taken shelter in a rough mining cabin high in the wilderness. Then, after dark, they heard movement outside. Not one noise, not one passing sound in the brush. Repeated sounds, heavy impacts, footsteps, something circling the cabin. Then, according to their account, rocks began crashing into the structure from outside. Large stones struck the roof and walls through the night, hard enough to terrify the men inside. In the most dramatic versions of the story, one of the creatures even reached through a cabin opening while the miners fought to keep it out. The miners said they stayed trapped inside until morning, expecting the cabin to be broken open at any time. If their account is true, that is what makes Ape Canyon different from a normal sighting story. This was not a glimpse at a distance, not a footprint in mud, not a shadow between trees. It was a siege, a long, violent, deeply physical attack on a remote cabin in the dark. And when morning finally came, the men fled. The story exploded in newspapers almost immediately. Reports described shaken prospectors emerging from the Mount St. Helens wilderness, claiming they had been bombarded by giant rocks through the night by ape-like creatures. The case drew intense public attention in the Pacific Northwest and quickly became one of the most famous early Bigfoot-related stories in American history. But then the investigation started, and this is where the story gets far more interesting. U.S. Forest Service personnel looked into the incident. Their investigation did not confirm the miners' version of events. Later summaries of the case report that investigators found no convincing proof that unknown creatures had attacked the cabin. They also concluded that some of the supposed evidence, including large footprints, could have been fabricated. In other words, the official response leaned toward hoax, exaggeration, or misinterpretation, rather than an unknown species attacking men on the mountain. That skeptical conclusion matters, because if you tell the Ape Canyon story honestly, you cannot present it as solved fact. You cannot say giant ape men definitely attacked those miners. What you can say is this: a group of men in 1924 made a dramatic and specific claim in a remote area near Mount St. Helens. Their story became famous. Investigators did not verify it, and yet the case refused to die. Part of the reason it survived is the setting itself. The Mount St. Helens wilderness already had a reputation for isolation, harsh terrain, and older stories about strange beings in the mountains. Even before Ape Canyon got its modern name, the region carried folklore that made the miners' report feel less like a random invention and more like something that had tapped into an older fear already living in the landscape. And the other reason it survived is simpler. The miner's story is vivid. Too vivid. A lonely cabin, a mountain wilderness, nightfall, heavy rocks slamming into the roof, men trapped inside, armed and terrified, waiting for daylight. Even if you doubt every word, it is easy to understand why people kept repeating it. That does not make it true, but it does make it powerful. Over time, the Ape Canyon incident became woven into Bigfoot lore. The location itself became permanently associated with the story, and nearly a century later, people still return to the case as one of the earliest and most influential American Sasquatch legends. In 2024, coverage marking the 100-year anniversary showed that the story still draws attention, debate, and reinvestigation. And that leaves us with the real question. If the miners lied, why tell the story that way? Why invent not just a sighting, but a siege? Why create a version so dramatic that it would invite scrutiny, investigators, and public doubt? But if they told the truth, then what exactly was outside that cabin? A group of men terrified by animals in the dark, a hoax that got out of control, a shared panic in an isolated wilderness, or something unknown moving through the forests around Mount St. Helens in 1924. That is why Ape Canyon still works as a story. Not because it is proven, because it is not. Because even now, the case lives in that narrow space between reported history and legend. The miners said something came to their cabin that night. Investigators said the evidence did not hold up. And almost 100 years later, the mountain is still keeping the final answer to itself.